Hello, everybody. You're very welcome to the third Power Hour webinar of 2024 on the subject of the power of sustainability. Sustainability is spoken about in pretty negative terms, sometimes even, as much as we know that we need to be aware of what's going on with climate change and weather events that affect our businesses and our own ability to travel and, all that kind of good stuff. So we are aware that sustainability is something that we need to be working on in our personal lives, but more especially in our organizations and making our own contribution. So today's speaker is sustainability business strategist Niamh Flaherty Pimentel, who's very, very welcome today. And
Thank
she'll
you, Claire.
not at all, lovely to meet you. Set the current landscape and the reasons for getting your sustainability plan started. We're very aware that people haven't maybe started such a thing, so we'll take it from the very beginning. And Niamh will share some practical tips on how you can do this and how you can run a successful sustainability plan. We'll have questions throughout the session. You're more than welcome. Our colleague Kate is fielding questions in the chat. And so if you have anything that you'd like to ask, pop it in there. We'll see how we're doing for time, whether we can take questions as we go along. That's up to Niamh. She's in the driving seat. But we will have a Q&A section towards the end of the session, and that'll give you the chance to catch up on anything that we haven't hit on before. We'll hit the 1:30 mark is when we will finish, so everyone gets to have a break and maybe get a bit of sunshine and enjoy the strangely summer day that we're having. And one question, will slides be available after the session? Thank you very much, Mr. or Mrs. Purcell. Yes, we will be sharing the video. So even better than the slides, the video will be available to everyone who's attended, and you'll be able to get Niamh's full explanation of everything. So people are still arriving in, and that's great. So we'll let them come in. I'll leave Niamh take the driving stick, drive steering wheel, whatever it is, and carry on with the session, and we'll catch up with you in a few minutes. Thanks very much, Niamh.
Great. Thanks a million, Claire. So, right, I'm on with the driving stick, as we're saying. So off I go. Really, really big welcome to all of you who've joined. I see a great number here joining, hopefully a couple more in the next minute or two. Yep, it's going up. So listen, a big welcome. And suppose just to say, before I dive into the agenda, it's just to say, obviously, you've been introduced to who I am. My name is Niamh. I work across businesses in Ireland, right across many sectors, helping organisations develop, execute and implement their sustainability strategies, from organisations that are at the very, very beginning to organisations that want to really be leaders in their sector and go after certification and reporting and the likes. So I'm super passionate about the topic. Hopefully I can bring that passion to this hour to leave you inspired to take some further action in your organisation. So enough about me. We've loads packed into the session. So a quick introduction. We're going to dive into then essentially what is sustainability. This might sound really basic, but this is where I always start. There's lots of confusion around terms and the like, so we'll demystify that a bit. And we'll talk a bit about the policy landscape, which is a really big driver for us operating here in Ireland. We'll talk a little bit around stakeholders and pressure and opportunities that you may face in your organisations. And then I don't want to say a deep dive because it's not a deep dive, but we will touch on key topics within the environmental, the social and the governance pillars of sustainability. We'll touch very briefly on some reporting, certification and standards that I think it's worth you all knowing about. And we'll do a little wrap up at the end, including, as Claire mentioned, a bit of a Q&A. So absolutely feel free to add comments or questions in the chat as we go. We'll see how we're going, whether I can pick them up or wait till the end. But don't be shy. I'd love to hear from you all. And on that note, I'd love if anyone's comfortable just popping it into the chat, I'd love to hear what do you think sustainability means to your organization? Like, is there a word that pops into your head when you think about sustainability and where you work? And don't worry, just whatever pops to mind. I'd love to just get a feel around the virtual room, let's say. So if you're comfortable, pop that in. And the other question again is, what stage of your sustainability transformation would you say you're at? So where is your organization at? And you may be the leader in your organization, or you may be in here given the task to take this on, let's say. So I put in just one to keep it simple if you think you're at the beginning. Two, if you believe you're building on foundations that you've already laid over the last couple of years. Three, perhaps you're a leader in your sector, and absolutely that would be fantastic if we have a few of those in the room. So just don't be shy, pop in what comes to mind there on those, and then promise that's all the direct questions I'm actually going to ask you. So let me just see. Oh great, oh lovely, I love this now. Being responsible, brilliant. Absolutely. So, and then we've got a couple of people answering the great. I mean, level 2, brilliant. 1, 1, 1, 2, 1. Brilliant. So we're seeing a bit of a mix there in terms of don't be shy, keep coming through there. We can look at it at the end. But so most of you are either at the beginning, or you feel, no, actually, we've done a bit already. We just want to build on that. No leaders in the sector. Maybe you're just being shy. And being responsible as well was one of the answers to what you think sustainability means to your organization. So on that note, we're going to dive right into the content. So, sorry, it's getting stuck here. So you're right. I kind of asked that question at the start because I'm always curious to know what springs to mind when you think of sustainability, because we all probably have different ideas in our head. So I'm starting here, right? The very basics. What does sustainability actually mean? And taking it in its simplest, rawest form, we're talking about the ability to maintain or support a process continuously over time. I'm going to keep coming back to that word continuously, because that really is, for me, like a huge part of sustainability. It's not a once-off job. It's a continuous iterative process of improvement. So what does sustainability actually mean when we talk about it in the broader context of the world and the businesses that we operate in? Well, a lot of the time we think about environmental topics, which it absolutely is. We think about climate change. We may think about biodiversity. We may think about, recycling, waste management, that kind of thing. And that gets a lot of the attention, and it's really, really important and a big area for us. But it's also talking about the intersection between the social aspect of how we operate as a society and the economic aspect of how we operate as a society. So sustainability is about the balance between the economic, the environmental, and the social pillars. And so if we have these in balance, we say we're operating sustainably. If they're out of balance, we're not operating sustainably. So just very quickly, think about a business that runs and makes fantastic profit, but they are destroying nature in the process. They are using lots of virgin materials, which is non-recycled materials. They're maybe using up natural resources that are limited, and just not respecting the boundaries of the planet. And perhaps they're using a workforce within their supply chain that they're not actually treating fairly. And so in that case, they will be out of balance. So the question for us all is, can we continue to live and work and produce and consume in the way that we are currently doing? We're all here because the answer is no to that. So we'll come back to lots of these points in a moment. But to say, you're hearing lots probably about sustainability now, or maybe you're hearing more than you had in the past. But back in the 1980s, the UN actually commissioned a report called the Brundtland Report, or more commonly known as our Common Future. And it was in this report that the sustainable development definition was actually first coined, or the phrase was first coined. So it is a development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. That's why we hear a lot about, are we stealing for future generations, or that word or that term future generation comes up a lot. So this was back in the mid to late 1980s. Also, a couple of years after that, early 90s, a, a phrase that you're probably all quite familiar with, or maybe you've heard of it, is the three Ps: people, planet, profit. So just to go back, that's essentially the same thing as the environmental, social, and economic. It's just a different way of saying it. So if you've heard it that way and you're thinking, oh, what does that mean? It's essentially the same thing. It was a British strategist that came up with that. So I said we're not doing so well. So let's put some numbers around, well, how are we doing and how bad does it look? Well, this is a really useful resource. It's called it's called Earth Overshoot Day. They predicted for each year, so there is a 2024 one available, but I just wanted to use this one because it's the year is finished, obviously. So it basically tells us what countries are living within the planetary boundaries and which ones aren't. And at a global level, how are we doing? So the first chart, the green and the red one, tells us that if I look at that green or that red bar and the green bar and where they meet in 2023, it's around about in August. So that's telling me that by August of 2023, we as a world population had used up all the resources available to us. So that's not far off halfway through the year. And we had essentially, we're borrowing from future years is essentially what that means. If you look at the other graph, you can see, apologies, it's going to be hard for anyone to see in there. You'll be squinting in at the screen, but I can tell you that Ireland is sitting around April the 21st. So that's when we as a nation had used up all the resources available to us in that year. So it tells us Ireland has a huge part to play in getting ourselves out of this. And you can see there's countries that are, not using up resources till December, and there's others in February. Massively unequal. And that's where a lot of the social injustice, comes from. So in terms of what does that mean? Well, it means that we're facing lots of global sustainability challenges. This list here is not exhaustive. It's just, I suppose, a snapshot of some of the big sustainability challenges that we are facing. So when I say we're living unsustainably, a lot of these things are how we're living unsustainably. We're causing climate change. We're experiencing loss of biodiversity. We here in Ireland have experienced water scarcity. Things like modern slavery, particularly you hear about that like in the likes of the fast fashion industry. Education awareness, we're here today, which is fantastic to see. I see 31 up there on my list. Raising awareness about sustainability and the challenge we face is a challenge in itself. So you can see it's really, really broad, the types of challenges that we're facing. So the good news is that there is international collaborative consensus as to the fact that we need to do something. Back in 2015, the United Nations, we got the Paris Climate Agreement signed in 2016. And the Climate Paris Agreement is where I'm sure some of you, if not all of you, have heard of the term net zero. This is where this all came from, because underpinning the Paris Climate Agreement is the need to limit average temperature increase to less than 2 degrees centigrade, ideally 1.5, and achieve net zero emissions by mid-century. So that's where we're hearing this net zero target for 2050. And that's where some of you probably here on this webinar maybe have been involved with setting some of those targets within your organization. Maybe you've been heavily involved in that, so that might be interesting to hear if we can at the end. And also along with the Paris Climate Agreement, we have the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. These are essentially a list of 17 goals with lots of actions within each goal. And they're basically like a to-do list for the world. It's telling the world, you need to achieve these by 2030. And they weren't actually designed with a business kind of perspective solely in mind, but thankfully, and it's great, lots of businesses are looking and going, how can I align with these? How can I play my part in delivering on these goals? And particularly publicly listed companies or companies that have large companies, let's say, you can go on their website, you can look at their sustainability report, and often most of those will actually have linked themselves to the impact areas within the SDGs. Someone like the likes of Kerry Group, for example, I know use them, and lots more. So you might want to do a little bit of Googling and you'll find some, or indeed some of you here may actually be aligning yourselves to those. And I'll share a useful resource at the end, how you can figure that out yourselves with a free online tool. So that's what's happening globally. We're obviously here in Ireland and we're a part of the EU. So the EU policy landscape very much been led by what's happening globally and the Paris Climate Agreement. They launched the European Green Deal in about December 2019. It's about becoming a climate neutral continent by 2050. Ideally, the aim is we're going to be the first. It's about protecting human life, animals and plants by massively cutting pollution. This is a big one, helping companies become world leaders in clean products and technologies. Huge amount of investment is going into companies that can innovate and bring us forward in a positive way. And likewise here in Ireland. And really to help ensure a just and inclusive transition. Again, back to that Venn diagram at the start, where this can't be at the detriment of a whole big social group or cohort. This has to be done in a just and fair way. And so we here in Ireland are very much being led and guided by this European Green Deal. So there's a lot going on in it. So I want to earmark you to the things that really are crucial, I think, for you to get out of it here today, is that in Ireland, we have looked at the European Green Deal and we've said, what do we need to do as a nation to play our part in delivering on that European Green Deal? And so we have in place, it's called the Climate Action Plan. It launched in 2021. It's enshrined into law. We have updates every year. So the picture here is the Climate Action Plan for 2024. It sets about very ambitious targets, and rightly so. When we think back to our April date a few slides ago and our overuse of natural resources and planetary boundaries, we're looking for a 51% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and net zero by 2050. That requires huge effort from every sector. We've got massive challenges. We're off track at the moment. We've got some serious big emitting sectors, which all come with their own challenges. So there's no quick fix. The report focuses on 6 key sectors and talks a bit about recent progress. I would definitely recommend, if you haven't heard of this or you're not familiar with it, you'll get it online on gov.ie and you can go on and just look at your sector, find where you fit in to these buckets and see what is laid out. It's really, really important because this is basically what we need to do as a nation. So that's policy. That's what's really going to drive us, because there's a lot of clear policy, as I said, it's in law. But you might be thinking, okay, I'm hearing about policy, but trying to relate this back to me and my organization. So what I'd love you to do just now is we're just going to take a moment to think about, from an environmental, a social, and an economic perspective, the organization that you're in or the organization that you have in your mind. Look at the list under each of these and think, is there anything here that my business is already doing? So, do we have a procurement spend? No doubt you all do. Are we doing something around waste management? Are we measuring our emissions? Maybe we are, maybe we aren't. Do we have a health and safety policy and procedure? Do we train and develop our staff? Maybe you're here on as part of a training development, program of work. So the point of this is to say these are the types of topics that fall within the 3 pillars, not exhaustive by any means, but hopefully you will look at this and you'll see a couple of things here and you'll think, okay, I'm doing something. We're doing something, especially for those of you that said you're a level 1. And I'll show this slide again. So don't worry if you're flying to try and write something down there, because it'd be remiss of me not to mention ESG at this point. I've talked in terms of sustainability, and you might be wondering, so what's the difference? Why is Niamh talking about sustainability, not ESG? Well, for me, they're 2 sides of the same coin. So sustainability, like from a corporate perspective, we're looking about profitable business, generating positive social impact, operating within the planetary boundaries, so not having a detrimental impact on any of the kind of the circles within our Venn diagram. ESG is the financial sector lens. It's about strong financial returns due to careful consideration. And notice it's ESG. So that G represents governance. You'll notice economic. So the E represents the environment, not the economic pillar. They simply drop the economic pillar because they think, well, you know, if I'm assessing businesses, I'm assuming that they're financially viable. Otherwise, I wouldn't even be looking at them. And where it gets a little bit mixed up is that, and it doesn't matter, I say mixed up is probably the wrong way of saying it. ESG is very easy to relate to. So lots of people go, I can develop my strategy and I can have an E, S, and G pillar. And I have clients that do that. And that's totally fine. But they don't need to be in the financial sector to do that. So the key message that I'd like to leave you with here on this slide is to say sustainability is the absolute goal. ESG is a term that we can use to help kind of figure it out, but sustainability is what we're trying to do here. And so if we then move on and think back to the previous slide where I had the economic pillar, now all I'm saying is governance pillar fits in here. Still the same topics within the environmental and social that I mentioned. And this is basically the list of topics, and not exhaustive, but the ideas of topics that may be relevant to you and your organization. So again, you might look at the governance one and just think, is there anything within that that actually is we're doing? Maybe you have a board structure, maybe you have a data protection privacy policy. So yeah, so have a little just a look at that and see, is there anything that you're thinking, okay, we're doing that, or no, we're not. And maybe that's something I want to think about looking at. So how do you figure out what you're supposed to do? You know, so there's a big list and there's lots of companies out there doing lots of things. So my question is, who and what is driving your sustainability agenda? That's the really important question for you in your organizations, because you don't need to be everything to everyone. You don't need to try and impact absolutely every area, because you won't be able to. You need to find out where is your biggest impact areas. And so you do that by talking to your customers and clients, your employees, your suppliers. The government obviously is leading out with the policy, financial services. Will you need access to private funding in the future? Maybe some capital investment. Will you need to go to the banks? If you do, they will ask you what you're doing in terms of sustainability. Maybe you'll get pressure from NGOs and you may think of other key sustainability key stakeholders that your company faces. So start thinking about who are our key stakeholders? Who are the people that we would need to talk to understand what they expect from us? And I'm going to keep kind of coming back to the stakeholder concept throughout. But these groups of people will give you the clues of where you need to do work and prioritize, where there's opportunities and where there's risks. So listening to what all these have to say and taking the clues is my big piece of advice on this. So to conclude here is just to kind of say, you know, why would you embrace sustainability? I'm telling you, there's policy coming down the road. It's laid out there, not down the road, it's laid out for us. I'm telling you that your stakeholders are probably wanting you to do things. And if you start listening really closely, you'll get some clues. But you need a good why. And absolutely it's the right thing to do. But sometimes that just doesn't quite kick us into urgent mode. So you might decide that actually it's going to really help you attract and retain talent. Or you might think, I think I might be in scope for some mandatory reporting, so I need to get on with this. Or I think this will give me a competitive advantage. And these are just 8 potential areas you might think of others. So you might just want to think about that in terms of how would you kind of engage people in your organization and give a bit of a kind of a motivational kind of factor to getting to moving on with this, let's say. So I'm looking at the time here. Let's see. There's a quick clock to see. Okay, perfect. Okay, you're all quiet on the chat there. So I'll keep going. We're doing pretty good on time. So what I want to do now is I've thrown quite a bit at you there. So I've really put this into bite-sized information across the environment, the social and the governance, because I want to give you a bit of inspiration and idea of where you could go off to if you're thinking, okay, I need to chat to a couple of stakeholders. I need to understand where we're at today. And then I need to understand like what would I need to do under the 3 pillars? What are the kind of things? So I'm just going to talk about 2 things under the environmental pillar. I'm going to talk about carbon footprint and the circular economy. So first off, at a corporate level, one of the main responses is to understand your carbon footprint. So the question is, has your company measured your scope 1, 2, 3 emissions? Perhaps you're looking at me going, I don't know what she's talking about. So super ladybird version of what we're talking about here is essentially we're emitting lots of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. They're forming a blanket around the Earth. It's causing heat to trap, and that's essentially causing global warming. So we're emitting lots of different greenhouse gases, but carbon is the biggest one. So basically it's the everything is converted into carbon for easy comparison. So when we're talking about carbon calculations, it could include methane if you've got livestock or something like that. So that's just to kind of clarify that. And then scope 1, 2, 3 is your scope 1 is your direct greenhouse gas emissions, your direct carbon footprint. And that's if you own company facilities or you own company vehicles. If you don't own either, you've no scope 1. Scope 2 is indirect, and it is generally speaking, purchased electricity through, say if you lease a property. So say you're a financial services firm, you've got a big office in the city centre and you lease that property. It's the emissions from that sits in scope 2. Then you have scope 3. This is where it gets a bit trickier because you've upstream, downstream, and you've a lot of things that you don't control. So you've things like business travel, employee commuting, waste generated in your operations, in your office, in your factories. You have use of your sole product. If you sell a product, you have the end of life of your sole product. So, you know, it's quite involved, let's say. And so just to give you a bit of a visual of if you're sitting thinking, oh, I wonder where my emissions sit in my organization. So this is a graph from the World Resource Institute, and it breaks down the average emissions of 16 sectors. I'll just move that out of the way there. And basically it's showing that like in very intensive organization like cement and steel and transport, a lot of their emissions is coming from scope 1, you know, that ownership of a vehicle, of a building and all that. You can see kind of that scope 2 in no scenario typically is the biggest. So typically it kind of is the lesser of the 3. But you can see then as you go up, if you're like selling goods, you know, you're a retailer and you're selling your Tesco, most of your emissions will sit in scope 3, which is why it's so challenging. You might be wondering, financial services, how do they only have scope 3 emissions? The only way that can be the case is if they're an organization that are fully remote. So they don't lease an office, they don't own an office. All their employees are out there working in home offices and the likes, and it's falling into scope 3. It's a bit unlikely, but I just want to show it kind of for effect, let's say. So to sum that up, scope 1 and 2 are most within your organization's control. 2, in some cases, the solution exists to deliver net zero for scope 1 and 2 emissions, in some cases, but most often scope 3 is where your impact is. And also businesses have less control on how scope 3 emissions are addressed. And herein lies the challenge. And committing to reach net zero will involve tackling your scope 3 emissions. So you might be thinking, okay, I kind of get that, but how do I go about doing something with that information that needs to share? Well, I want to leave you 2 resources on this section. One, on gov.ie, there's a climate toolkit for business. Start your zero carbon journey. It's a carbon calculator. If your organization hasn't started measuring, this is a free resource. It'll get you started and it'll get you a feel and an understanding for where your emissions are. So definitely go in, check that out. And then I'm also just wanted to highlight science-based targets. And this is a not-for-profit initiative to help organizations align their net zero strategy with the science. So to make sure that organizations are going with the science as opposed to off on some other trajectory. Mainly focused around supporting the larger organizations set these targets and audit and verify them. But they have a small to medium and SME route as well. So at the very least, it's a really good resource to just go in and they have lots of really useful information and you can get some ideas and thoughts without even needing to go and getting verified, let's say. So for me, they're probably the 2 most useful resources under this topic. So then the other aspect of the environment that I mentioned I said the circular economy. And what do I mean by the circular economy? Well, you more likely relate to this when I talk about waste management or recycling or the likes. So 90+% of how we operate across the world is a take, make, dispose model. It's a linear model. We extract virgin materials and non-recycled materials. We make stuff, we use it, and we dispose of it. It never gets back in the loop. That's a huge circularity gap. The circular economy model is about less raw materials, less waste, and fewer emissions. And this is a really, really critical component, along with the carbon calculation side of things, for us as a global population to hit that net zero target by 2050. We're going to need to make enormous strides with both these topics. Hence why I hone in on those two. So why do we need to switch? Well, we need to protect the environment. We need to reduce raw material dependence because it is limited. And ultimately, we're going to create jobs and save consumers money. So we don't have loads of time again to get into this in great detail, but the idea is to keep materials constantly in circulation and to think more about consumption. Do we need to consume? Can we reuse? Can we repair? And to help you out here, again, I've come up with, say, two, I think probably, the most useful maybe resources, practical resources that you could take away. So the Ellen MacArthur Foundation for Circular Economy Ideas, really, really useful. You'll get some inspiration. Go have a little look around that and see is there anything that you think could be helpful for you and your organization. And it could be something as simple as deciding we just need to sort out our recycling problem. Because honestly, every organization I go into, they say, I know it's small, Niamh, but we've a real recycling problem. Like, people aren't putting it in the right bins. And I always say, it's not small, and start with something that you think you can get some traction with, and you can see some results. So my waste study, it's Ireland's official guide to managing waste. The reason I put that up here is because if you wanted to run some education sessions with your company, you can download posters and free labels and stuff that you might want to use within your office. So really useful. Again, these are free resources. So, financial resources limited for most of organizations. So again, just hopefully some useful things to kind of earmark you or point you to. So that was your whistle stop tour of the environment in about, 6 or 7 minutes. So hopefully I've left you a few useful tools to go check out. On to social, and by far the easiest one, to get your head around. And no doubt you're all doing something and, plenty and lots, let's say, on this already to build on. So S is all about the people. And it covers everything from workplace safety, work-life balance, well-being, to consumer protection, to LGBTQ plus rights, to community engagement, and everything in between. So hopefully you're looking at this and thinking, fantastic. I might be at a 1 or 2, but we're doing loads of stuff here on this, or we've started on some of these things. We can build on that. And so the key thing, though, from a sustainability perspective, when we think about where the ambition is going and how much we have to make, how much progress we have to make, is that we cannot just be thinking about the social aspect of things and the people in relation to our organization and our people within our organization. We need to be thinking about all the people our company interacts with, excuse me. So it is your employees, but it's also your customers or your clients. It's also your suppliers. It's also your communities and whoever else that you interact with. It's no longer acceptable. Back to my example around the supply chain, and maybe you're getting, you're getting raw materials, or someone is packaging a product for you, for example. It's not good enough to not know. You need to know what's going on within your supply chain, within your whole value chain. And so back to those topics, you need to understand, at a broad level, what's going on, and make sure that there isn't, dodgy labor practices going on basically under your watch, even if it's not indirect employees. So it's really trying to push on where organizations are at. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that when we talk about some reporting that's coming down the road. But flew away. On the social side, if you're looking for some inspiration or ideas, absolutely go and look and see what other companies are doing, maybe companies in your sector. I just put this one up as an example of a company that seems to be doing a lot on the social side. I don't have any experience with them. I've never been to the hotel, but they came up on my radar because it's Armada Hotel in Clare, County Clare. And they're a B Corp certified company, which is the sustainability certification, which I'll tell you a little bit more in a moment. So hold that thought. Um, but they have an interesting, I was reading up on their social initiatives, and they have an initiative called Elevate Foundation. It's about looking after the well-being of the young people in their county, County Clare. Then they also have a separate internal well-being program for their employees. And then they have a lot of community support where they're trying to really engage, support the community, whether it be through a local sourcing supplier agreement and various other things. So it's just to kind of get you thinking about, maybe you have a really strong well-being program internally, but might get you starting to think about, how could you get involved in the kind of wider your wider remit or your wider scope of your social sphere, let's say. So I just thought they were interesting when I came across them. And then the other one I wanted to earmark you to, and again, back on the other one, is just to say, if you know of a company that you like, you admire, go look at their website and see what they're at, and you might get some inspiration and ideas. This is another big area of focus. Thankfully, here in Ireland, we're starting to make strides, albeit a long, long way to go. But we have the Irish Centre for Diversity. It's Ireland's only equality, diversity, and inclusion mark for business. You can get certification at a bronze level, a silver, and a gold, which is committing, embedding, and leading. So again, have a look on that. You might get some ideas, inspiration, or just thoughts on how maybe you can start on your diversity, equity, inclusion program. Maybe you're not doing anything specifically on this. This is really useful resource, and the people there are really helpful if you reach out to them. So again, that was a whistle stop tour of social, and now we'll keep governance really simple, because to be honest, sometimes we can get a bit confused around governance, and I actually see it quite simply, to be honest. And I just think about it in terms of, is what we're doing good management? And so the way you're operating, and the way you put rules and policies and procedures in place in your organization, is that set up in a way that's fair to everyone, that's holding people accountable? Do you have a way to measure whether you're achieving your goals, for monitoring, reporting? It's all that structure that you're doing already in other aspects of your business, but it's making sure that you have that in place from a sustainability perspective. And it really is like, it's really kind of the bit that almost like the glue, if for want of a better phrase, because if you don't have that structure in place, you might be doing lots of great things, but you don't even realize you're doing it, or you're not even measuring it. So it's really, really important to have that structure in place. And it's really absolutely critical to have a collaborative relationship between your board and management, or if you don't have a board, your owner, or whatever way your ownership structure is set up, because they can't operate without one another, but they have to be working together. And what I mean by that is, the management team, the management group, are the ones that are going to be identifying and prioritizing your risks and opportunities. They're going to be looking, people like yourselves, looking, going, who's going to own this? Who's going to do it? How are we going to measure it? What KPIs are we going to put in place? But the board is there to educate the directors on the material risks and opportunities. They want to focus on the material ones. And they need to ensure that it's integrated into the board process, so that on a monthly basis, when the board meets, that these KPIs that are most relevant to present to the board are presented month in, month out. And there's this constant feedback loop going between board and management. And that's back to one of my first slides. That's back to that continuous piece. That's just going to be a continuous cycle. That's not going to kind of end. And so getting that relationship working together at the start is, like, I can't stress how much that's critical to the success of any program of work that you take on. So let's see, we're doing pretty good here, 109, coming towards the end of the slides. So that's a flavor of kind of the topics that you might be looking at. And now I just want to present super briefly how you might go about pulling some of this together. And this is just a 7-step proven process. It's my process that I use with any of my clients when I'm taking them through this. And basically, you start with initiating, which I'll talk about a bit in a moment. You engage internally and externally, prioritize issues. You often have to loop back. So it doesn't mean that you're going linearly. Sometimes you're looping back. You develop your strategy, develop a detailed plan, and put it to action. You share your story. Now, there's no way we'd have time today to do any of this justice by going into any great detail. So I just want to get you thinking about the first steps here, because there are things that you could do quite easily after the session. And I'd love for you to be leaving feeling like you kind of have a few quick wins, let's say. So in the initiate stage, the question is, do you have top level support? Is there someone on your board, or is there people on your board aware of sustainability? That might sound like a funny question, but it's a valid question. Do you have a sustainability team in place? Do you have people in your organization that are really passionate about sustainability? What's your current position? Back to that slide where I said, look at the E, S, and G. Are you doing any of these things? Map out where you are today, just today, before you do anything or think of any big ideas. And who are your key stakeholders? And who could you start engaging with? And that brings me to this really important part, which is you can start engaging straight away. I mean, you probably are already, but some of you maybe at level 1 maybe aren't having those conversations. I absolutely encourage you to go out and have a chat about ESG topics with your groups of stakeholders. If you have a client meeting, pop it in there. Say, what are you guys doing in ESG, or what are you thinking about this? If you start listening, you'll start picking up what are the important and impactful areas they believe for themselves and therefore want you to be looking at. You can get lots of cues in these conversations. You also get ideas and opportunities where you may be able to collaborate, which can all inform your strategy. And I say to kind of any group I'm working with, look at the leaders in your sector, look at your competitors. Chances are you're all going to come up with a similar thing in your space, because your focus areas will generally be the same if you're selling the same product or service. So get the clues. You don't need to kind of reinvent the wheel. Look and see who's out there, who's leading the charge, and who can you kind of get some ideas and inspiration from. And then just to say, how do you go from engagement to prioritizing? Well, this is just an example from Bank of Ireland. In their case, they looked at 25 topics, and they went out and they did 9 external stakeholder interviews. They did 25 external stakeholder surveys, and they surveyed 247 internal colleagues, and they did some workshops. So I don't want you to be daunted by that. That's Bank of Ireland. Most of us here probably aren't on the size of or scale of Bank of Ireland. But the thing is that when you start engaging, gathering this information, that's how you figure out where your big impact areas are. And it's really, really important to do that, not just with what you think internally, but what all your key stakeholders are thinking and expecting and potentially asking of you. So that's very, very brief in terms of how you would kind of start that off. And a lot of that stuff you could start doing today. And that's why I kind of wanted to hone in on that part of it. It would be remiss of me not to just briefly at the very end here, and we literally have a couple of minutes for this, just to mention there are loads of reports, loads of certifications, loads of standards, so many that you'd be left terribly confused. So I'm going to hone in on just a very few of those. But just to show you what we've been talking about in the last kind of 40 odd minutes. Global goals, we've talked about the Paris Climate Agreement, Sustainable Development Goals. Reporting frameworks, we talked about science-based targets. I did mention Carbon Disclosure Project, if anyone can remember that. And regulation, which is going to be a huge driver for us here in Ireland because we're within the EU, is a new mandatory reporting requirement called CSRD, called the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. If you haven't heard about it, you're going to hear a lot more about it, because it's replacing the non-financial reporting directive. Its aim was to bring sustainability reporting, mandatory sustainability reporting, to the same level as financial reporting in the EU. And we have companies right now in the throes of figuring out that reporting, because it started in FY 2024 this year. And for large PLCs, public listed companies and public interest bodies, who would have been reporting on NFRD previously. And basically, they, at the end of FY 2024, they will be submitting their report. So we are right in the midst of it. And the big thing is that you see this grid down here with the 4 columns. They have to assess themselves on 10 topics under environmental, social, and governance, as to what is materially impactful, where is their material impact. And there's a whole lot behind that we just couldn't get into here today. But I just want to mention that little icon that says double materiality. Just, if that's all you hear, just take that away, because you're going to hear organizations talk about that more and more. That's the mechanism by which organizations need to figure out their priority areas, their priority focus areas, and where they'll have to disclose. And they are now legally obliged to look across their value chain. So you may not be in scope for CSRD today, but imagine if you have a client that's in scope. They're going to come asking you about certain things, because it's their responsibility to understand what's going on within their value chain. And if you're the customer supplier of theirs, they're obliged to be asking and to understand and to make sure that they're not involved in anything, untoward. So it's kind of coming thick and fast at us. And that's why I say to organizations, listen, you may not be in scope today, but you are probably already experiencing, or will be very soon, getting questions about this. So I think this is potentially the last slide, or nearly the last slide, is to just say on certification, you can either look at certification from a holistic sustainability perspective. So B Corp certification and business in the community, they are broad sustainability certification standards. They cover everything within sustainability. And then you have kind of narrower ones like the science-based targets, which is, as I mentioned, is like the environmental pillar. It's within that. The likes of the ISO, the International Organization for Standardization. Again, that could cover governance and or any of the other topics, depending on which ISO you're going for. And there's the likes of the Keep Well Marked, an IBEC initiative, and various others. So again, trying to think of practical tools to leave you with. I think these are 2 really useful resources that I'm going to pinpoint and point you to. I mentioned the B Corp certification, and I use the Armada Hotel Group as an example. But what's really useful, this is for organizations who want to be certified. It basically for companies who are really fairly advanced on their sustainability journey, and have really ambitious policies and strategies in place. I have a couple of clients a month that are either gone through the process or are within the audit process. And it's a really fantastic certification to go for. But what I often say, sometimes, looking at the group here, some of you maybe you're only at the start, so that would seem like a massive stretch for you. But actually, you can go on and do their impact assessment for free. You don't need to submit anything, but it will tell you a huge amount about where you're doing well and where you've gaps, where you're not measuring things, and where you could be more ambitious. It is a phenomenal tool. I really recommend it. It's free. You just need to sign up, and you don't even need to. I often use it as test accounts. When I'm playing around with different things, you don't need to put in loads of information. It's free. It's there. And they also have an SDG action manager, which is what I mentioned at the beginning. You could do answer their little survey, and it will tell you, based on the information you put in, where your company can have the most impact on the SDGs. And these are all completely free. So I've shared lots of things there that are free resources, which hopefully is always welcome, but they're good quality ones. I want to just share ones that I felt would be really useful and not bombard you too much. So final kind of how we getting on. Okay, we're pushing it now, but I promise I'm almost there. Quick wins. Think about where do you see immediate gaps? Is there a few light bulbs kind of going off in the head there? Maybe you're engaging with key stakeholders. Are there any conversations you can have quickly? Maybe you're really friendly or you've got a really good relationship with one particular client. You think, actually, I could have a really good conversation with them, soon. But what about an employee survey? Maybe you think, cheapers, I know we get great feedback and ideas from our employees. Maybe we can look at something like that. Are we good at doing things, but maybe we don't have policies in place? That's quite a common thing. People doing lots of great things, but the structure and the policy isn't there. Are you measuring your carbon footprint, your greenhouse gas emissions? What about the circular economy? Maybe you've got a canteen and you've got single-use plastics left, right, and center. So hopefully between those kind of thought-provoking questions, hopefully, and some of the resources, you'll be left with some ideas of how you can actually go off today and do something. And so I will leave it on that note to say, if you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. Whatever you do, you have to keep moving forward. Obviously not mine, Martin Luther King Jr. But to say, listen, if every company out there was doing their bit and continuously, back to my favorite word, doing bit every day, we'd be in a much, much better place. So,
well,
Q&A 10.
That was one hell of a whistle-stop tour, Niamh. Holy God. That's great. The amount of paper I'm using to take notes, it's disgraceful. So that's definitely something I have to do. One of my personal goals. That was fantastic. Thank you very much, Niamh. You've given us so much to think about. We've got a couple of questions that everybody was obviously on the same lines as you, or same thinking, which is great. So we've got a cohort here. We're building a community with this webinar. And Fiona just asked a question: is there any real point in my company planting trees to help the environment? Does it just look like a PR stunt if that's all they're doing? So that's kind of back to your policy and your greenwashing.
Yeah, really good question. Like what I would say is, if you don't know why you're doing something, then it's probably not the best thing to be doing. So if you think, actually, we want to do something to support support our local community, and we know that there's a group that go out and are planting trees, and we want to get our workforce involved in doing some volunteer work, and that's part of our strategy on the community development side of things. And so we're going to do that. But if you're kind of doing things where you don't really have you're just doing it because maybe you think it might seem good, I say challenge yourself to go, why am I doing it? And if you can't give yourself a good answer to convince yourself why, then maybe have another think about it.
Okay. And we've a question. It's also related to employee company strategy and employee activity. So Alison asks, the average age of my colleagues has fallen in the last few years. I think a lot of companies are saying that. How likely are they to want to be involved in the company's sustainability plan?
Great question. And my experience, and I'm in and out of so many organizations, is that there's so many people passionate in organizations and want to get involved. And yes, there is, there's lots of young people getting involved, but there's also a good mix in terms of kind of profile. But what I would say is that I'm getting more and more people coming to me saying, Niamh, I'm getting asked about what we're doing in our interviews. So before that person even becomes an employee, they're checking to go, is the company actually doing anything here? Can they tell me what their strategy is? And if they're not getting a good enough answer, they're not interested. So that's quite remarkable. So my experience is definitely they do want to get involved. Obviously, that's a bit of a sweeping generalization, but I've never had a challenge trying to get a team together in any organization, because you'll always get a few passionate people, and I always like to get some of the younger, maybe graduates in, because they'll bring really fresh ideas that maybe some of the rest of us aren't thinking about. So I think you're going to see them wanting to get more involved, and we'll have an expectation that you're doing something pretty ambitious.
Right.
Yeah,
And I
good
know
question.
that's something that comes up a lot in the Irish Times group, which Irish Times
Yeah,
Training is part of, because we've got such a diverse range of business units that, you know, like my home and ourselves would be kind of looking at electricity and not necessarily resources like vehicles or whatever, but the newspaper delivery would, and the
yeah.
printing, all that kind of stuff. There is something relating to that in the chat. Hold on 2 seconds. So David Murphy says, we take care of printing of media house titles, which includes the Irish Independent. Would this activity be considered as scope 1 or 2 emissions for our organisation, and scope 3 for media house? Oh my God, that's
So give me
basically
that question. Give me
everything.
that question again. I'll have to listen very carefully to
So
that.
printing of the newspapers, would it
Yeah.
be on behalf of a client? Would it be considered a scope 1 or 2 for us, the company doing the printing, and scope 3 for the client that we print for? You're looking at your upstream, you know.
So you have a printing company basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So so the
yeah.
printing company, again, you'll be thinking about, does that printing company have a site that they own where they print, and how are they powering that? So it will depend on how they're doing that. So or maybe they're leasing somewhere where they go in and they print. And then so you kind of, so it's not, you can't tell straight away unless you have the answer to those. And then you're trying to think about it from the perspective of the, hit me with the second part, Claire, the company then that's
So the
buying
client
the
that you're printing for, is it scope 3 for them?
client that you're printing for. Yes, exactly. Yeah, because it's going to be the product at the end of the day.
It shows how complex it is. And one of your points there about creating a team to, you know, drive this, not necessarily drive in a negative way, but to make sure that you're actually looking at every single part of the organization, because there are things that you think wouldn't have an impact and they actually do. And it's
Yeah,
just being able to oversee that and update people.
yeah,
And just one final
exactly.
question from Maeve.
Oh, great.
Small companies from mine will struggle to fund planning with consultants. It sounds like a very expensive thing to do. Can we find support for funding and planning? And I suppose developing the skills that are needed for that.
Really good question. And that's why I try to put in like resources that are free, that if you get a team together, there's certain things that you could go off and get started on. But like, everyone has their day job. So that kind of is a challenge. Sometimes you need a bit of extra support that you just don't have there. And then I'd actually recommend for small organizations and indeed larger ones, go on to Enterprise Ireland, and they have a green grant section, and that's what they call it. But it covers things like, you know, lots of things within sustainability where you can get grants. And they also, that B Corp certification, they've launched a new grant there where you can actually get, you know, you could bring someone in to help you get certification there. So have a little look at that. There is funding available, and it's kind of raising awareness for that, and then tapping into anything that's kind of free out there too. So definitely urge. I missed the name of whoever asked that question, but definitely Enterprise Ireland. You can go on and check out those green grants.
Great. And then if you just want to go on to the next slide there, Niamh,
Yeah.
something that we're doing to contribute to people's skills and abilities to deal with this. And I suppose it's for people that are, whether you're at the beginning, you're kind of at level 1 or level 2 that you introduced us to initially. In November, we're having a sustainability masterclass with Niamh. It's in person for decision makers. Now, decision maker can be at kind of any level of an organization. So it does mean that people that will be setting the strategy and policy in place. So it's, you know, it's kind of people that will be making things happen. It'll help people to create a framework for your organization, because it's like David's question about the printing there. If we had a framework in place, a kind of a mind map, as one of my lovely colleagues loves creating mind maps, or whiteboard, as another colleague loves creating, that we could refer to on an intranet or whatever, we'd know where we are, what the input is, and maybe what contribution people could make, so people can make, you know, kind of bring themselves to the project as well as doing their day job. So we'll share details with webinar attendees about that. Or you can email us directly at courses@irishtimes.com for more details. We'll have those in the coming days. Niamh, that was one heck of a lunch with a difference, and we've given plenty of food for thought to people, even if we haven't delivered actual food. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your time.
Oh, thanks a
Obviously,
million, Claire.
it's something that's
My
going to
pleasure.
be, we'll be talking about again in November. To remind people again, shameless plug, I don't mind. We will be having a masterclass where everybody is welcome to join us. Get yourself involved, get your framework, your policies, all of that good stuff. Start using the jargon, and something I've written down here. Just start using the jargon, understand it, and understand where your stakeholders are coming from, and you'll be putting yourself in a good position to start on the road to sustainability. So thanks very much, Niamh.
Thank you so much, Claire. Thanks everyone for attending.
Thanks a million. Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.